The veteran didn't flinch. He just sat there, hands shaking on his cane, until a voice behind them whispered, "That's enough." And when they turned around, Jack Reacher was already walking toward them, and not one of them was ready for what happened next. Welcome to Jack Reacher Heroics. Let's uncover what really happened. The coffee shop buzzed with the low hum of early morning conversations. The aroma of roasted beans filled the air, mingling with the sound of steam from the espresso machine. In the corner by the window, a disabled veteran sat alone, his hands resting on his cane, his gaze distant as he sipped his coffee. His faded jacket, decorated with patches from a lifetime of service, spoke volumes about the life he'd lived, one of sacrifice and resilience. Yet, today, he wasn't noticed, not by anyone who mattered. At the counter, a group of young men leaned in, their voices growing louder with each passing minute. One of them, a tall, scruffy guy in a hoodie, pointed at the veteran and let out a cruel laugh. "Look at him," he sneered, "probably thinks he's still a hero, sitting there all high and mighty." The others chuckled, clearly enjoying the mockery. The veteran didn't react, his eyes still fixed on the empty street outside, as if he were lost in memories no one would ever understand. But the jeers didn't stop. They escalated. "Maybe he's waiting for his government check," one of them taunted. "Can't even walk straight. Must have had too many bad drops in the field." The veteran's hand gripped his cane a little tighter, but he said nothing, the weight of their words heavier than the pain in his body. It was a silence that spoke louder than anything he could have said. Behind them, unnoticed at first, Jack Reacher walked in. He didn't stand out in a crowd, just another tall man with a quiet demeanor and eyes that seemed to see everything. But something in the air shifted as he made his way to the counter, scanning the room, his gaze briefly landing on the group of mockers. A chill seemed to run through the coffee shop, though no one said a word. Jack's focus was sharp, and it wasn't long before he understood exactly what was happening. The veteran's silence was a wall, a fortress built from years of hardship and unspoken pain. He had lived through battles, both on foreign soil and in his own mind. He had seen the horrors of war, the cost of freedom, and the weight of loss. The scars on his body were nothing compared to the ones that remained hidden beneath his weathered skin. But silence was his shield now, the one thing he could still control. The young men's taunts echoed in the space around him, but he didn't flinch. He had long since learned to shut out the world when it got too loud, too harsh. There was no use in fighting back. He had seen too much to waste energy on fools who didn't understand. The veterans who had been to war, who had lost friends, who had lived through the hell of it all. Those men didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They had paid their price already. As the mockers laughed, the veteran simply took another slow sip of his coffee, the warm liquid sliding down his throat like a small comfort. His hands trembled, but it wasn't from fear or anger. It was the toll that years of service had taken on his body. The knees that once ran across battlefields now ached with every shift. The joints that once moved with precision now groaned with arthritis. But still, he remained still, watching the world pass by as he had done for so many years. The insults continued, growing more personal, more cruel. But he kept his focus on the window, on the distant street beyond. He had seen much worse in his lifetime. The words of these young men were nothing more than noise, a fleeting moment in time. They could laugh, they could mock, but it would not matter in the end. And so, the veteran sat there in silence, his head held high, though his heart ached from the weight of it all. The young man in the hoodie leaned closer to his friends, his voice growing louder with every word. "Look at him," he sneered, gesturing toward the veteran. "Probably thinks he's some kind of hero, more like a relic of the past." The others laughed, their voices rising in a chorus of cruelty. "Yeah," another one added, slapping the table, "the kind who talks about the good old days like that's going to get him anywhere now." He mimicked an old, gruff voice. "Back in my day, we fought wars for freedom." The mockery was thick, and the group erupted in laughter, drawing the attention of a few nearby customers. Seriously, a third mocker chimed in. "He can barely walk. What's he even doing out in public? Just sit at home and wait for your pension, old man." The veteran's hands tightened around his cane, but he didn't react. He hadn't moved since they'd started, his eyes never leaving the street outside. Inside, he could feel the sting of the words, but he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a response. Let them laugh. Let them think they had power over him. Wonder how much he gets for just sitting there. The first mocker continued, his words dripping with disdain. You think the government pays for all those meds? A lifetime of nothing but handouts. No wonder they're always begging for attention. The group laughed again, and the words stung even more this time. But still, the veteran remained unmoved, like a statue carved from years of suffering. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. He had already paid his dues. If they wanted to mock him, let them. But inside, the weight of their insults pressed on him, a reminder of how far people had drifted from respect. The mockers didn't notice, though. They were too busy feeding off each other's laughter, too lost in their own arrogance to see the pain they were causing. The door to the coffee shop swung open with a soft chime, and for a brief moment, the noise inside the bustling cafe seemed to fade. Jack Reacher stepped inside, his tall frame filling the doorway, casting a long shadow across the room. His presence was undeniable, though he wasn't trying to draw attention. The bustling chatter, the clink of coffee cups, the distant hum of the espresso machine, all of it seemed to slow, as if the space itself acknowledged him. He didn't look like much at first glance, dressed simply in a black jacket and jeans, with no entourage or flashy accessories. Yet there was something about the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his stride, that drew eyes. He didn't stand out, but he was impossible to ignore. As he approached the counter, his gaze flicked over the room. His eyes briefly landed on the group of young men who were still mocking the veteran, their words loud and shrill. Reacher's gaze held for a second, then moved on. He ordered his coffee in a calm, unhurried manner, but something about the way he stood, his shoulders relaxed, his posture perfect, suggested that he was paying attention to everything. The mockers, caught up in their own amusement, didn't even notice him at first. Reacher's eyes never wavered from the group as they laughed, their voices rising again in volume, unaware of the quiet tension that had just entered the room. The veteran's silence, though painful, had made an impact on Reacher. He could tell. The old man was no stranger to suffering, to silence in the face of cruelty. But Reacher wasn't one for standing by when he saw something that needed to be done. He sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable, but inside, a decision was already made. Jack Reacher didn't need to be asked to act. He'd seen enough. The room had shifted, even if no one noticed it yet. Reacher was here now, and everything was about to change. The mockers were too caught up in their own amusement to notice the change in the air. Their laughter rang out like clashing cymbals, each taunt louder than the last. But the veteran's eyes, tired and heavy with years of silence, flicked toward the door for a brief moment, as if sensing something shifting. That's when they saw him. Reacher stood near the counter, his coffee in hand, but it wasn't the drink that had drawn attention. It was the way he stood, his body perfectly still, his gaze locked on the group with a quiet intensity that cut through the noise. It wasn't confrontational, but it was unyielding. He wasn't a man who needed a shout to be heard. The calm in his posture, the sharpness in his eyes, it was as if the world itself had paused for a breath, waiting to see what would come next. The mockers, still caught up in their own petty cruelty, caught sight of Reacher's steady gaze. The first one, the tall hoodie-wearing guy, paused mid-laugh. His grin faltered, and for the briefest moment, his confidence wavered. Reacher's eyes didn't shift. He wasn't glaring. He wasn't angry. He was simply observing, waiting, and that made the mockers' discomfort even worse. One of the others, a stockier guy with a baseball cap, looked over, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. He nudged his friend. "You gonna let him stare at you like that?" he sneered. But the young man in the hoodie only laughed awkwardly. He waved it off, trying to maintain the bravado that had sustained him until now. Who is this guy, huh? Think he's tough. But his words had lost their edge. They felt hollow now, as if Reacher's silent gaze had drained the room of their power. The young man leaned back, trying to regain his composure, but the unease in his eyes was unmistakable. The veteran noticed, too. His hand tightened around his cane, a spark of something, uncertainty, or maybe hope, flickering in his chest. The mockers didn't know it yet, but they had just been outmatched without a single word being spoken. The young man in the hoodie, clearly unsettled by Reacher's unblinking stare, tried to salvage the situation with another round of insults. His voice was louder now, attempting to project strength, but the cracks were already showing. He cleared his throat, forcing a smirk, and turned back toward the veteran. "Hey, old man," he called, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You think you're tough just sitting there? Bet you can't even remember the last time you really fought. Probably forgot what it's like to stand on your own 2 feet." The words were meant to sting, to chip away at the veteran's dignity. And for a fleeting moment, they seemed to hit their mark. The veteran's fingers twitched against the cane, his eyes narrowing as the taunts sliced through his already fragile resolve. But he remained silent, his gaze still fixed on the street outside. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a reaction, for any sign that the old man might fight back. The hoodie-wearing mocker, sensing the silence was an invitation for more, pressed on. "Come on, you must be proud of your little medal, huh? Does it even matter now?" He laughed, the sound full of cruelty. "You fought for what? So you could sit here and get your disability check? I bet they just hand you free stuff for being a war hero." A few in the group chuckled, but the humor was hollow. The veteran's grip on the cane tightened, his knuckles white, but he didn't look at them, not even as they laughed at his expense. It was at that moment that Reacher's calm broke. He hadn't moved, hadn't even shifted his weight, but something inside him stirred. He could see the damage those words were causing, even if the veteran refused to show it. No one had the right to tear down a man like that. Not in this place, not under his watch. Reacher stood then, and the noise in the room seemed to fade away. No words, just a slow, deliberate movement toward the group. The mockers hadn't realized yet, but their time was up. Reacher stood still for a long moment, his eyes locked on the group of mockers. His gaze didn't waver, but it was as though he was weighing something heavy, a decision that hung in the air. The noise around him seemed to dissolve into the background, replaced by the sharpness of the present moment. He could feel the tension, could almost taste it, but he didn't rush. The veteran's silence spoke volumes, but it was the mocker's cruelty that demanded action. He wasn't a man who liked to make a scene, but he wasn't the type to let things slide, either. The young men didn't understand what they were dealing with. They thought they could get away with mocking someone who had earned his peace, someone who carried scars from battles they could never imagine. Reacher knew that, and he knew that silence, though often a powerful weapon, only worked for so long. Sometimes when the world gets loud enough, you had to step in. The taunts continued, though they were growing weaker now, their edge dulling with every word. The mockers, still full of themselves, had no idea that the tide was already shifting. They were used to being in control, used to being the loudest voices in the room, but they had underestimated one thing. True power doesn't announce itself. It waits. Reacher's hand tightened around his coffee cup, his fingers steady, his mind made up. The old man didn't need to say anything. Reacher understood. He didn't need to be the one to fight, but he would give the mockers a lesson in respect, one that they wouldn't soon forget. He took a step forward, slow and deliberate. The young men hadn't noticed him approach yet, too caught up in their bravado, too wrapped in their own words. But the room had already started to shift, and now Reacher was part of the story. As his foot landed with a soft thud, the atmosphere in the coffee shop became thick with anticipation. The time for silence was over. The group of mockers didn't see it coming. They were too wrapped up in their own self-assuredness, too focused on their mockery of the old man, to notice the way the air in the coffee shop had thickened. Reacher's steps were deliberate, his movements slow but full of intent, like a predator on the move. The young man in the hoodie, still holding court at the center of the group, paused mid-laugh when he noticed Reacher's presence. His smile faltered for a second, but he quickly masked it with a cocky grin. "What's this?" he scoffed, glancing back at his friends. "The tough guy finally speaks up? What? You're going to lecture us about respect now?" The others laughed, feeding off the energy of the group, but something in the way Reacher stood, calm and unbothered, started to put a crack in their confidence. Reacher didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes, focused and unwavering, met the mockers with a quiet intensity. The young man's bravado slipped for just a moment, and in that brief second, the veteran, who had been watching all along, finally shifted in his seat. There was something in Reacher's stillness that spoke louder than anything the mockers could say. The hoodie wearer, sensing that the tension in the room had shifted, stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "You think you can take me, old man?" he taunted. His words were empty, laced with false confidence, but as he stepped closer to Reacher, his body language betrayed him. His hands trembled slightly, his posture faltering. Without a word, Reacher moved. It wasn't fast, but it was fluid, precise. In one smooth motion, he closed the distance between them, his hand coming up to catch the mocker's wrist as the young man tried to throw a punch. The room seemed to go still. Time slowed. The mocker's expression shifted from cocky arrogance to genuine surprise as Reacher's grip tightened. The young man's arm was held effortlessly, as if it weighed nothing at all. The first move had been made. Reacher hadn't spoken, hadn't even raised his voice, but in the space between them, he had already won. The room held its breath, caught between the tension of what had just happened and the anticipation of what would come next. The young man's wrist remained locked in Reacher's grip, his face now a mix of shock and disbelief. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by a deep, instinctive fear he hadn't known was there. Reacher's eyes never left him, steady and calm, like an immovable force in the center of the chaos. The mocker's arm dangled helplessly, the punch he had been so eager to land, now nothing more than an impotent gesture. His entire body seemed to freeze as Reacher's grip tightened just enough to remind him that, in that moment, he was no longer in control. The other young men, who had been laughing just moments ago, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Their confidence, once unshakable, was starting to crack. They exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to back their friend up or just stay out of the way. But the real power in the room wasn't in the hands that held the grip. It was in the quiet tension that had descended like a fog. Reacher didn't need to move quickly, didn't need to throw a punch or yell a threat. He had already said everything he needed to with a single, deliberate action. The veteran, who had watched the entire scene unfold from his corner, shifted again in his seat. His hands, still resting on the cane, seemed less tense now. For the first time, he allowed himself to look up from the street outside and take in the sight of Reacher standing there, a calm force in the storm. There was no fear in his eyes, only quiet approval. The mocker's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, and for a moment, it was unclear whether he was going to fight back or submit. The room waited, the silence hanging thick in the air, as the tension between them stretched longer than it ever should have. Finally, the young man's voice cracked. "Let go of me, man." But it wasn't a demand, it was a plea. Reacher didn't answer the plea. His grip remained firm, unyielding, his gaze unwavering. The mocker's voice trembled, his bravado entirely gone now, replaced with something much more raw, fear. The young man's arm was still caught in Reacher's hand, and despite his earlier confidence, he had no idea how to break free. The other mockers, seeing their friend falter, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could feel the tension in the air, a suffocating pressure that made them second-guess everything they had said moments ago. But they didn't know what to do either. This wasn't a situation they could laugh off or talk their way out of. "Let go of me," the mocker demanded again, but his voice lacked the force it once had. Reacher didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle, just stared at the young man with the same quiet intensity. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the coffee machine, the muffled conversations that continued around the perimeter of the cafe, completely unaware of the confrontation that was unfolding in the center. Reacher's voice finally broke the silence, his words calm, low, but carrying the weight of someone who had seen it all and wasn't impressed by anything. "You think you can mock a man who's seen things you'll never understand?" His eyes remained locked on the mockers, watching the fear seep into his features. "You think you're tough because you can hide behind words." The mocker, still caught in Reacher's grip, had no response. His chest heaved, his mouth working to form words that never came. and Reacher didn't give him the time to recover. "You've had your fun," Reacher said, his tone now more of a statement than a question. "But this is where it ends." With one swift motion, Reacher released the mocker's wrist, shoving him back just enough to send him stumbling into his friends. The group sat in stunned silence as the young man steadied himself, still shaken, the bravado completely gone. The veteran, watching all of this unfold, finally let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. And Reacher, without another word, turned his back on the group. The silence in the coffee shop hung in the air like a cloud, heavy and final. The group of mockers sat in stunned silence, their world upended in the span of a few moments. The young man in the hoodie, still trying to regain his footing, wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans. His chest heaved with the effort to process what had just happened. His friends, once so eager to laugh, now shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing at each other as if they weren't sure what to do next. For the first time, the young man's cocky grin had faded, replaced by a look of doubt. He glanced at Reacher, who was already walking away, the calm in his step unshaken by the confrontation. It was then that the reality of the situation hit him, a sharp contrast to the proud, loud bravado he had worn like armor moments before. "You okay, man?" one of his friends asked, his voice tentative, unsure. The mocker in the hoodie didn't respond right away. His eyes followed Reacher, who was now seated at the counter, casually sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. He looked at the others, then back at the veteran, still sitting in his corner, watching quietly. The crowd in the cafe had returned to their own conversations, unaware that anything had changed. But everything had changed. The young man opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. What could he say? What could any of them say? His pride, his earlier cockiness, had evaporated in an instant, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. He hadn't just been put in his place. He'd been exposed as nothing more than a loudmouth who had no idea who or what he was messing with. The veteran, still sitting motionless, met the young man's eyes briefly. He didn't say a word, but in that silent exchange, the mocker understood something profound. He had been confronted not by a fight, but by the stark reality of who he had been and the true measure of strength that Reacher had shown. In the end, it wasn't just the mocker's pride that had been shattered. It was his illusion of power, and it stung more than any punch ever could. The young man in the hoodie wiped his forehead, still reeling from the unexpected confrontation. His pride had taken a blow, and the reality of what had just happened was sinking in. But there was something else stirring in him now, something darker. The sting of his own humiliation was sharp, and it ignited a flicker of defiance. He looked at Reacher, sitting calmly at the counter, sipping his coffee. Reacher wasn't even paying him any attention, but that, in itself, was enough to fuel the fire inside him. The mocker's friends shifted uncomfortably, some eyeing him as if urging him to let it go. But the young man wasn't ready to back down just yet. With a deep breath, he stood up, his legs shaky but determined. "You think you're so tough?" he called out to Reacher, his voice strained but growing louder. "You think just because you walked in here like some big shot, you can make us all shut up?" The room went quiet again, the tension thick in the air. Reacher didn't move, didn't even glance up from his coffee. But his stillness only made the young man feel more exposed, more desperate to prove himself. "I'm not scared of you," the mocker continued, his words now a little faster, a little more desperate. "I fought tougher guys than you. So what, you want to show me how real you are? Step up." For a moment, the veteran in the corner watched, his expression unreadable, as if he knew exactly what was coming. But Reacher remained calm. He was the eye of the storm, unshaken and still. The young man's voice was louder now, a challenge, a dare, but there was fear in it, fear he hadn't fully acknowledged yet. Finally, Reacher set his coffee cup down with a soft clink. He didn't stand up, didn't posture. He simply stood still, eyes still locked on the young man. The mocker's hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding. He was testing Reacher now, try to force the man to react. But the real test wasn't whether Reacher would fight back. It was whether the young man could face the consequences of what was coming. And Reacher knew it was coming. The mocker's words hung in the air, louder now, more forceful, as he tried to provoke Reacher. His fists were clenched, his shoulders squared, but beneath the bravado, the tremble in his hands betrayed him. The room seemed to shrink, the pressure building as the young man took one tentative step toward Reacher. He was desperate now, trying to reclaim the control that had slipped from his grasp. But Reacher's calm remained unbroken. He didn't flinch, didn't react. His gaze was steady, unwavering, like a rock in a storm. The young man's eyes flickered toward the others, seeking some kind of support, but they were all too silent, watching with growing discomfort. The mocker paused, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. The standoff had gone on long enough. His pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "Come on, what are you waiting for?" he sneered, trying to force a smile. "You scared?" It was then that something inside Reacher shifted, not in his posture, but in the quiet decision he made in that moment. He stood up slowly, deliberately, his movements fluid but purposeful. The space around him seemed to contract, as if his presence was enough to change the atmosphere of the entire room. The mocker took a half-step back, unsure for the first time. He had pushed so hard, testing the limits of a man who had barely moved, and now, with Reacher standing tall and composed before him, he felt the weight of his own actions. There was no more bravado in the air, only the realization that he had stirred something in Reacher that was no longer passive, no longer patient. Reacher took one slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the young man's. The shift was so subtle, so swift, that it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't an action, it was a change in the dynamic. A warning. The young man's heart thudded in his chest as Reacher moved closer, and in that moment, he understood that the calm he had been facing was not weakness. It was power, a power that had been waiting to be unleashed. The veteran had been watching quietly from his corner, his hands still gripping the cane, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before him. For a moment, he seemed to fade into the background, a silent observer in a world he had long since distanced himself from. The taunts, the posturing, none of it was new to him. He had been on the receiving end of mockery many times in his life. But this was different. As Reacher stood, the shift in the air was palpable. The young man, who had once been full of bravado, now seemed smaller, his movements hesitant. The veteran saw it, that subtle change, the flicker of fear, the realization that the fight he thought he could win was slipping through his fingers. The veteran's breath slowed. He had seen men like Reacher before, though not often. The ones who didn't need to raise their voices to command respect, who carried an unspoken strength that could silence a room without lifting a finger. It was something the mockers would never understand, not until they learned the hard way. His eyes remained on the young man, but his mind drifted back to the days when he had been that cocky, that full of himself. He had been young once, too, thinking he was invincible, that he could outlast anyone with sheer will and volume. But time had a way of teaching lessons, whether you wanted to learn them or not. The veteran's hand relaxed on his cane, and for the first time since the mockery had started, he allowed himself to exhale. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew he had stepped in for a reason. Reacher hadn't come to prove anything. He wasn't looking for attention or glory. He was here to put things right, to restore balance in a place that had been disturbed by arrogance and disrespect. The veteran felt a warmth spread through him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, something like hope. Reacher was giving him a gift, a lesson that silence wasn't weakness. It was strength, and sometimes strength was all it took to change the course of a fight. The young man in the hoodie, his chest still heaving with shallow breaths, was no longer sure of himself. He had wanted a fight, a spectacle, but the reality of the moment was sinking in. Reacher's calm, his presence, had shattered the illusion that he was in control. The group of mockers sat back, their earlier bravado dissolved into uncomfortable silence. The energy in the room had shifted from excitement to tension. The mocker took a half-step forward, his fists clenched again, trying to regain his lost courage. "You think you can just step in and make me look weak?" He spat, though there was no real conviction behind his words anymore. "This isn't a movie. You're not some actor. Reacher didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. His action spoke louder than anything he could have said. With a swift motion, he closed the distance between them. The young man barely had time to react before Reacher's arm came up, expertly deflecting his wild punch with a sharp, controlled movement. The mocker's arm snapped to the side, his momentum carrying him off balance. Before the young man could recover, Reacher stepped in with a fluid motion, his hand catching the back of the mocker's neck and guiding him toward the ground. It wasn't a move designed to hurt, just to show control, to remind the mocker who was in charge. The young man crashed to the floor, a grunt escaping him as he landed with a thud. The room seemed to freeze, the noise of the cafe momentarily silenced by the sound of his fall. The mocker scrambled to get up, but Reacher stood over him, unwavering, his gaze fixed. "This," Reacher said quietly, his voice steady, "isn't about toughness. It's about knowing when to stop, when to respect others." The young man looked up at Reacher, eyes wide, his chest still rising and falling with rapid breaths. The mocking grin was gone, replaced by something else, humility, or perhaps the first glimmer of understanding. Reacher didn't wait for a response. He turned away, his movements calm and controlled, the lesson already delivered. The room remained still, as if processing what had just happened, but it was clear the young man had just been taught a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. The young man lay on the floor, dazed, his pride crumbling in the face of Reacher's effortless control. He scrambled to push himself up, his arms shaking, but his legs felt like rubber beneath him. The taunts that had flowed so freely just moments ago now seemed distant, hollow. The weight of his own fear began to set in, slowly creeping up his spine like cold fingers. He had expected a fight, something loud, something chaotic, but this was different. Reacher hadn't raised his voice, hadn't thrown a single punch in anger. His movements had been too precise, too deliberate, and now the mocker was left with the uncomfortable realization that he had underestimated the man standing before him. His friends, still sitting at the table, exchanged nervous glances, but none of them moved. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The energy of the cafe, once filled with the sound of laughter and insults, was now heavy, thick with the kind of tension that only comes when someone's bravado meets the cold truth of their own limitations. The young man wiped sweat from his brow, his breath shallow and ragged. His heart raced, and the realization hit him with full force. He had pushed too far. He hadn't just disrespected an older man. He had invited a storm. And now that the storm had arrived, he didn't know how to handle it. Reacher didn't speak, didn't even look down at him as he continued to stand over him, calm and unwavering. The young man's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that might give him a way out. But the crowd, the room, even his friends, they were all silent now. All eyes were on him, watching him struggle with the consequences of his actions. The fear grew, settling into his gut, a knot that he couldn't untangle. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to throw another punch, but something held him back. The realization was clear now. He wasn't the one in control anymore. And the weight of that truth was heavier than anything he had ever felt. Reacher stood over him, unmoved. His eyes, calm and unwavering, held the young man's gaze with the kind of steadiness that seemed to freeze time. The mocker's ragged breath filled the silence between them, the sound of his pulse pounding in his ears louder than the stillness of the room. Reacher didn't need to speak. He didn't need to act. His mere presence was enough to keep the young man rooted to the spot, unable to do anything but feel the weight of his own panic and regret. There was no triumph in Reacher's expression, no smirk or smug satisfaction. His face was an emotionless mask, but there was a power in that stillness, a power that the mocker could feel pressing down on him like a weight. It was the kind of calm that came from experience, from knowing how little words mattered when you had the strength to back them up. Reacher's composure was his weapon, and in the face of the young man's turmoil, it was more effective than any punch could have been. The young man tried to gather himself, to find some scrap of courage to stand up, but every time he made a move, his body felt too heavy, too unsteady. His eyes flicked from Reacher to his friends, but none of them came to his aid. No one spoke, no one moved. Everyone in the room seemed to understand that this moment was out of their hands. Reacher didn't make him wait long. After a few seconds, he slowly, deliberately turned away from the young man, his back straight, his movements fluid and controlled. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the quiet room as he made his way toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The mocker sat there, still on the floor, watching Reacher leave, the full weight of the lesson sinking in. The calm that had enveloped the room was not just Reacher's. It was the lesson itself. In the face of arrogance and aggression, true strength didn't need to boast. It didn't need to shout. It simply existed, quiet and undeniable. The mocker remained on the floor, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, his mind racing to process what had just happened. His friends hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, and he could feel their eyes on him, those that still dared to meet his gaze. They hadn't helped him, hadn't come to his defense, and he realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't going to. The smug confidence he'd carried into the coffee shop was now a distant memory, shattered in the wake of Reacher's calm and controlled presence. He pushed himself up slowly, his hands trembling as he found his footing. The taste of humiliation lingered in his mouth, sour and bitter, and every muscle in his body screamed at him. But it wasn't from the fall. It was from something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. Reacher hadn't even broken a sweat, hadn't needed to raise a fist. The man's power was in his restraint, his silence, and the realization gnawed at the mocker. "Come on, man," one of his friends muttered, breaking the silence. "You okay?" The mocker didn't answer. He could barely process anything beyond the thumping in his chest. He didn't want their pity, didn't want their concern. He wanted to regain control, to prove something, anything. But as he looked around the room, something shifted in him, an understanding he hadn't expected. He realized that the moment had already passed. The fight, the challenge, it wasn't for Reacher. It had never been about proving himself to Reacher. It was about proving something to the crowd, to the veteran, to himself. But now, there was no victory to claim. The young man slowly turned toward the veteran, who had watched everything unfold with a quiet resolve. For the first time, he wasn't just seeing the old man as a symbol of weakness, of age. There was something in the veteran's eyes that spoke of resilience, of dignity, something that he lacked. And with that, the weight of his arrogance began to lift piece by piece. He couldn't take back his words, but he could change how he carried himself moving forward. The lesson, unspoken, had been learned. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't the loudest person in the room. The veteran sat quietly in his corner, his eyes never leaving the young man who had once mocked him. The tension in the room was slowly starting to ease, but the weight of the moment still lingered in the air. His hands, still gripping the cane, had loosened, and his shoulders, once tense, had relaxed. He hadn't moved much since Reacher's intervention, but now, as he observed the mocker's shift, something in him softened. The young man was no longer brash, no longer full of the energy that had fueled his mockery. He had sat back down, his posture slumped, his head down, as if all the air had been sucked from his chest. There was a quiet hum of discomfort around him, the others unsure whether to approach or simply let the moment pass. The veteran, however, felt a quiet stir in his chest, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, gratefulness. Not just for Reacher's intervention, but for the subtle shift in the young man's demeanor. It was something the veteran knew all too well, something he had learned long ago. Respect had to be earned, but it could be reclaimed. He had lived through enough to understand that people could change, could grow, and sometimes all it took was a moment of clarity, a shift in perspective to make them see the world through different eyes. And that was exactly what was happening in front of him. The mocker was no longer the man who had walked into the coffee shop, throwing insults like darts. He was someone different now, someone who had seen the consequences of his own actions. The veteran's hands, once tightly clenched, relaxed even more as he stood up slowly, using his cane for support. His legs, stiff with age and the weight of countless memories, carried him forward. He didn't say anything. There was no need. His presence, his silent acknowledgement of the change, spoke volumes. And as he moved past the young man, he placed a hand on his shoulder, just for a moment, offering something that was rare: forgiveness. A simple gesture that spoke of understanding, not anger, and the kind of wisdom that only comes with age and experience. The young man sat there, the weight of his own actions still pressing down on him like a leaden blanket. His friends had gone quiet, their earlier bravado completely gone, and even the energy in the coffee shop had shifted. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being judged, not just by Reacher but by the veteran too. The weight of the man's silent forgiveness sat heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't just let this moment slip by, not without trying to prove something, without doing something to regain his sense of control. He had been humiliated, yes, but he wasn't ready to walk away defeated. He didn't know how to handle the stillness, the quiet that now surrounded him. But he knew one thing: he wasn't finished. His fists clenched again, more out of habit than true aggression. The sting of Reacher's calm still burned in him. The veteran's quiet strength had shown him that sometimes true power didn't need to be proclaimed. It simply existed. But that didn't sit well with him. He wanted to feel powerful, to feel like he had control over something, anything. He stood up suddenly, startling the others. His body was tense, every muscle wound tight, like a spring ready to snap. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Reacher, who hadn't moved from his place at the counter. Reacher hadn't acknowledged him, hadn't even looked up. "You think you've won?" the young man said, his voice raw, desperate. He was trying to steady himself, to find the strength he had lost. "You think I'm just going to let you walk away like this?" There was no immediate response from Reacher. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the challenge. But something in the air shifted once more. The young man's challenge hung there, unanswered, but felt just as loud as any punch. Reacher's silence was the final answer. The young man was already defeated, not by fists, but by the simple reality that he couldn't break what was unshakable. And with that realization, the last embers of his defiance died out. He turned away, the final challenge slipping away with him, leaving only the quiet echo of what had been. Reacher sat still, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his gaze unwavering as the young man took one last desperate shot at proving himself. The words had been loud, sharp, and full of the same bravado that had fueled the mocker's earlier taunts. But Reacher didn't need to respond. He didn't need to say a word. The real answer had already been given, not through punches or challenges, but through the space he had created with his silence. The young man had no idea how much Reacher had already taken from him, without lifting a finger. The room had returned to its uneasy calm, the young man's challenge lingering in the air like a bad taste no one could shake. But Reacher didn't flinch. His resolve wasn't about proving anything. It was about understanding the deeper weight of the moment. He knew when to fight, when to let go, and when to stand still. What the young man had failed to grasp was that power wasn't about winning at all costs. It was about knowing when to stop, when to let the other person's words fall flat, when to silence the noise without ever needing to engage. As the young man stepped back, looking for any last glimmer of validation, Reacher didn't move. He wasn't going to coddle him, wasn't going to give him a show. Reacher didn't need the applause. He didn't need anyone to understand. His strength was in his calm, his ability to navigate the world without allowing it to dictate his reactions. The young man had wanted to fight, but Reacher had already won, because sometimes not engaging was the strongest thing you could do. The mocker's shoulders slumped, his defiance drained, leaving behind only a hollow understanding of how misplaced his arrogance had been. Reacher's quiet resolve was the real lesson, the kind that couldn't be taught by fists or harsh words. It was learned through action, through the willingness to be present, without ever needing to prove anything to anyone. The young man stood there, his chest still rising and falling with quick, uneven breaths. But it wasn't just physical exhaustion that weighed him down now. The earlier rush of adrenaline had faded, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. His eyes scanned the room, not daring to look at Reacher again. The others at the table, the ones who had cheered him on, who had fed off his bravado, sat in uncomfortable silence. Their eyes were down, avoiding his gaze, no longer eager to support him. The mocker had been the leader of the group, the one who set the tone, who pushed the others to follow his lead. But now, as the weight of his own defeat settled in, it became clear. His authority, his dominance, had evaporated in an instant, not through a fight, but through his own failure to back up his words. He had called for a challenge, and when it came, he had crumbled. For the first time, he realized the emptiness of the power he had wielded over his friends. It wasn't real strength, it was noise. His pride, once his shield, had turned to ash. He had tried to be the loudest, the most confident, but in the end, the leader was the one who had fallen hardest. As the room grew quieter, the mocker caught the glance of his closest friend. The look wasn't one of admiration or respect anymore. It was something more distant, more reserved. The silence between them said everything. His friend didn't need to say anything. The unspoken words were loud enough. You've lost. The mocker swallowed hard, trying to force a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He glanced over at the veteran, who remained unmoved, his gaze still calm, still unshaken. The veteran hadn't flinched at the mocker's taunts, hadn't reacted to any of the insults. And now, as the young man stood there, he realized the real defeat wasn't just his own, but the loss of his place as the leader, the one others looked to for strength. He wasn't a leader anymore. He was just another voice in the crowd, and that was the hardest truth to face. The atmosphere in the coffee shop had shifted entirely. The sounds that once filled the room, laughter, chatter, the clink of cups, had become muted, distant. The energy was no longer electric with youthful arrogance. Instead, it was heavy with introspection. People were more aware of the silence now, the absence of the mocker's usual bravado, the way his friends sat in uneasy stillness, unsure of how to respond. The veteran, still seated in his corner, continued to observe the room with quiet understanding. He had seen so much in his life, but what had just unfolded was something different, something raw. He knew the young man would leave here changed, whether he realized it or not. The mocker had come in as a leader, brimming with false confidence, but he had been brought to the ground, not through physical violence, but through the quiet presence of someone who understood what real strength was. And that had broken him in a way nothing else could. The young man stood near the table, his hands now trembling, his posture hunched. His friends, once eager to laugh at his jokes and follow his lead, now couldn't seem to meet his eyes. He wanted to speak, to say something to reclaim what he had lost, but the words stuck in his throat. There was nothing left to say. The bravado had been stripped away, leaving him exposed in a way that was both painful and necessary. He glanced toward Reacher, who was still seated at the counter, quietly finishing his coffee, seemingly unaffected by the storm he had caused. The young man opened his mouth, trying to form an apology, but the words were stuck. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy with the weight of realization. The veteran watched all of this, his hand resting gently on his cane. He hadn't interfered, hadn't offered advice. But in the way the young man stood there, vulnerable, the lesson had already been given. The aftermath wasn't just the silence in the room. It was the change in the young man's eyes, the understanding that pride wasn't power, and that true strength didn't come from tearing others down. The coffee shop was nearly empty now, save for a few lingering patrons who seemed hesitant to leave, caught up in the tension that still hung in the air. The mocker, his shoulders slumped, was no longer the center of attention. His friends had all but melted into the background, unsure of what to say or do. The veteran, who had been the quiet witness to it all, had become the real focal point of the room. Without a word, the veteran stood up slowly, using his cane to steady himself. His movements were deliberate but careful, the weight of age and time pressing down on him. He wasn't in a rush, wasn't eager to leave, but it was clear that the time for silence had ended. He had seen the mocker's change, understood it for what it was, an unspoken acknowledgement of defeat, but also a quiet turning point. As he made his way toward the door, the young man's eyes followed him. For the first time, the mocker's gaze wasn't filled with contempt or superiority. It was something else, respect perhaps, or maybe even a sense of gratitude. The veteran had not once raised his voice, had not once fought back. He had let the mocker expose himself, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of his own actions. The silence had been the most powerful weapon of all. The veteran reached the door and paused for just a moment, glancing back at the room. There was no dramatic farewell, no words of wisdom spoken. He simply nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement that what had transpired was enough. And with that, he walked out into the quiet of the street, the door clicking shut softly behind him. The room was still, the noise from before long gone, replaced by a lingering sense of something earned, something unspoken. The young man, still standing in the same spot, felt the sting of the moment start to fade. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the quiet strength of someone who didn't need to prove anything. The veteran had been the hero of the day, not because of any grand gesture, but because he had taught the most important lesson of all. That true strength lies in silence, in restraint, in being the kind of person who doesn't need to announce their power. The room remained quiet long after the veteran had left, the absence of noise almost louder than any words could have been. The mocker stood there, still rooted in place, his thoughts racing. His friends, who had once followed his lead, now avoided his gaze. Their silence spoke volumes. No one was laughing anymore. No one was egging him on. He had been the leader, the one they all looked to, the one they believed could carry them through anything. But that power had been taken from him in an instant, not through physical force, but through the calm resolve of a man who had nothing to prove. And now, standing in the aftermath, he realized something he hadn't before. Respect wasn't something you could demand. It wasn't something you earned by mocking others, by showing off, or by pretending to be tough. It was something you had to earn the hard way, by showing humility, by standing firm when others would crumble, by being the kind of person who didn't need to boast. The young man glanced over at the empty chair where the veteran had sat. His words, though few, had carried more weight than anything the mocker had ever said. The silence, the calm, the unshakable certainty, it had broken him in the best way. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about how to regain control, how to reclaim his place as the center of attention. He was thinking about what it meant to truly be a man of strength. He turned slowly, his gaze falling on his friends, who were now watching him with uncertainty. There was no defiance in his posture now, no desire to lead with empty gestures. His shoulders slumped slightly, not from weakness, but from the understanding that he had learned something deeper than any fight could have taught him. He had earned nothing by mocking others, but perhaps, just maybe, he could start to earn the respect of those around him by being someone worth respecting. The mocker let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. It wasn't the loud, triumphant moment he had once imagined. It was quieter, more personal. And in that silence, he realized that the respect he sought wasn't found in dominance or arrogance. It was earned through understanding, through quiet actions, and through the willingness to change.